This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and today I'll be filling in for our regular host, David Boris. It's Friday, July 17th, 2026.
We're now dealing with levels of technology and sophistication that it's not just a one-off system. This is a system that is bouncing high-frequency radio waves off the ionosphere to detect what's happening.
On June 22nd, 2026, Canada and Australia finalized a landmark $2.5 billion government-to-government defense agreement, marking the largest defense technology export in Australian history. Under the deal, Canada is acquiring Australia's over-the-horizon radar technology derived from the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, with engineering work set to begin this July. This new network will allegedly allow NORAD to see thousands of kilometers past the Earth's curvature, eventually replacing Canada's aging North Warning System. Today, Dr. Thomas Hughes, Dr. Andrea Charron, and Dr. Malcolm Davis join us to discuss Canada's new partnership with Australia on Arctic over-the-horizon radar, why Canada is adopting Australia's JORN system, what it means for NORAD modernization, and how this project fits into Canada's broader continental defense plans. I note that many of these interviews were recorded in late June and early July 2026. This is the Expert Series. First, we'll turn to Dr. Thomas Hughes, Assistant Professor at Mount Allison University and the Deputy Director of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Thomas, it's been a while. Thanks so much for coming on again. What is in the new Canada-Australia partnership on Arctic over-the-horizon radar, and what are the parameters and implications of the new deal?
So, to answer that question, I'm afraid I'm going to have to start by going backwards quite a long way to understand sort of the parameters of this equipment and why we have it, why we need it. We have to understand something of the dynamics of the evolution of Canadian defence and defence policy. So, in essence, as the Cold War developed, we had an increased understanding, and the technology, especially around missiles, developed. We had an increased understanding that there was a possibility of an attack from the Soviet Union, probably using intercontinental ballistic missiles, potentially air-launched weapons or missiles fired from submarines. But there was this real risk that there would be something that would be travelling through the Canadian Arctic to strike a target further south, and particularly for those intercontinental ballistic missiles, they would be transiting over the North Pole to hit a target further south. And to try to respond to that, or enable the best possible response to that, we needed to know as early as possible what was happening. So between the United States and Canada, 3 lines of radar stations were built, the most northerly of which is called the Dew Line, or what's called the Dew Line, the distant early warning radar systems. It's an incredible piece of engineering. If anyone wants to go and look at that, I would heartily recommend it, because it was a remarkable project. And essentially, that was a line of radar stations in northern Alaska, northern Canada, to provide early warning of an attack coming across the North Pole. As technology has changed, improved, the way that the speed with which we have to respond to an attack that's coming over the North Pole has increased rapidly. So our warning time is much lower. And so the ability to see what's happening on the other side of the world over the North Pole is hugely important. Our ability to do that is critical to the defense of the North American continent overall. And it has been very apparent that our ability to do that has been degraded significantly. The technology that we were using previously can't perform the role that we want it to perform at the moment. And so with that in mind, the conversations about how do we protect the North American continent and the Arctic more broadly have been happening for quite a long time. And we had in 2022 the announcement of NORAD modernization, which we might come back to in a few moments' time. And a huge part of that was improving our ability to detect threats earlier than we're currently doing. And so new over-the-horizon radar, new radar systems was very, very high on that agenda. And Canada has been thinking about what new systems to implement, again, for a number of years. And it became apparent that Australia has a very effective over-the-horizon radar system already. And buying that sort of off-the-shelf solution was an opportunity for Canada that was perhaps offset some of the development costs that came in. So in terms of the absolute parameters of what this over-the-horizon radar can do, I'm not privy to that information. I don't know exactly how far into Russia this would see, if at all. I'm afraid I don't have that. But the big implication of this, I would suggest, is that once this is up and running, hopefully in 2029, Canada will be able to point to its functioning and operating an over-the-horizon radar system that is the equivalent of any other in the world. That this is a piece of exquisite technology, that this provides Canada with a robust capability and is a real signal of Canada's, not only of Canada's ability to provide information about the Arctic environment and what's happening over the horizon in the North Pole, but also its willingness to be part of that effort to ensure the defense and security in North America.
How do you think this partnership fits into NORAD modernization as well as shared defense priorities with other allies?
So this is a huge part of NORAD modernization, and this is one of the central pillars of what NORAD modernization was about. Fundamentally, NORAD, to start with, has a warning mission, and to be able to warn, it needs to be able to see, and to be able to see, it needs radar. And so NORAD modernization had as one of its core principles improving over-the-horizon radar, improving radar systems. So this is following through on the promises that the Canadian government had made in terms of modernizing NORAD and Canada's contribution to modernizing NORAD. So essentially that data which will be collected from the radar stations that are in Canada will be fed into NORAD to create a more holistic picture of what's happening in the Arctic. In terms of shared defense priorities, I think this does a few things. First of all, the Arctic is an increasingly considered region for Canada's key allies, particularly in NATO. And there are a lot of conversations happening at the moment about how we reconfigure the way in which NATO protects the Arctic, defends the Arctic, understands and operates in the Arctic. So the fact that Canada can provide this information, that Canada can commit that component of capability to its allies, I think is a real signal of what Canada can do. It's a real signal that Canada is committed, and it will enable NATO writ large to create a picture of the Arctic that is, again, more holistic than it has ever been. It will hopefully enable a picture to be knitted together from Europe and Canada and the United States as well, but particularly for our conversation, for Canada and Europe, to knit that picture together, to understand the Arctic as a region of shared concern and a region in which cooperation can take place. And Canada is really offering something quite special to that.
Well, thanks for those insights, Thomas. And to close out this part of the discussion, how does over-the-horizon radar actually work, and why has Australia been building these systems, and how can Canada benefit?
I'm not an engineer. I am not an expert on these things entirely. So hopefully the explanation that I give is of use to lay people. I can say I am not clever enough to understand the inner workings of all of it. Essentially, radar, as it has been for decades since it was invented and first put to military use, sends out a signal. That signal is reflected back off an object, is received, and a picture can be built up of where things are in relation to that radar. The problem with this is that essentially it requires a line of sight. If you can't see something with a telescope, it's kind of difficult to use radar to see something. If there's a dirty, great big hill in the way, you can't see what's behind that hill just with your radar. It's firing in a straight line. This becomes a real problem given that, contrary to some belief, the Earth is actually round. It's not a flat disk. So what that means is if you are firing radar signals directly north, in fact, in any direction, but for our purposes today, we'll talk about directly north. At some point, if those those signals are going in a straight line as the Earth curves, it can no longer see what's happening on the other side of the hill, essentially. So some very, very clever people worked out that what you can actually do is to keep that straight line system going, but essentially bounce the signal off the ionosphere. So the signal goes up, hits the ionosphere, bounces down, is reflected off stuff on the other side, comes back up the ionosphere and bounces back down to your system. So you keep those two straight lines or those straight lines going, but now you can see, as it were, on the other side of the hill. So the over-the-horizon radar essentially uses the ionosphere, as far as I'm aware, to be able to kind of mitigate the effects of the curvature of the Earth on standard radar signals. And this is, for me, it is magical technology. The fact that we have come up with this is just insane and wonderful, that there are people clever enough to do this. Now, why Australia has been at the forefront of this, I think, is really interesting. And this speaks to geopolitics and geography much more broadly. Essentially, this comes back to Australia's geographic position and where they have understood threat to be coming from. Australia is quite a long way from a lot of things. And if it is going to detect threats as early as it needs to, let alone wants to, it needs to be able to mitigate the challenge of the curvature of the Earth. Otherwise, they would need to put radar stations well out beyond Australian territory in order to see those threats coming. And because of that imperative, Australia has been, I would suggest, incentivized to develop the technology. And as I'm sure you're aware, once you start to develop that expertise, then it attracts more expertise and you can continue to develop the technology. So essentially, Australia have arguably stolen a march on the rest of the world. They've done that because they've needed to, because of their geographic position. So if anyone's interested in looking at this, the Jindalee Operational Radar Network is worth looking at. And that really is the manifestation of where they've got to so far with the over-the-horizon radar. So in that sense, they are an ideal partner for Canada to be working with. The alternative, or one alternative, would have been perhaps for Canadian technology to be leveraged, to be developed. This is always a difficult decision for a government to make. They've taken the decision to go with an essentially off-the-shelf solution. That's a whole different conversation. I'm pleased to see in the announcement that just came out that there is a requirement for Canadian companies to be involved in the process of building these systems. So this is not going to just be an Australian firm coming in and not contributing to the Canadian economy. That doesn't appear to be the case, which is a real positive. And hopefully it means that we have a working top-level radar system in the next few years.
Next, we'll turn to a conversation we recorded with Dr. Andrea Charron a few weeks ago around the time of the Canada-Australia announcement. Dr. Charron is the director of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us once again. Canada is overhauling its northern surveillance to better track modern threats like cruise missiles. The federal government has been shifting from old line-of-sight Arctic radars to over-the-horizon radar, which, for our listeners who aren't familiar, basically bounces signals off the atmosphere to see thousands of kilometers further. With the first phase of construction contracts officially signed, work is now beginning on initial radar sites. So, Andrea, to start off, could we maybe define what we're actually talking about here? What is over-the-horizon radar, and how does it differ from traditional radar systems most people might be familiar with?
So over-the-horizon radar systems tend to bounce high-frequency radio waves off the ionosphere, and the ionosphere is the active and electrified layer of the Earth's upper atmosphere. When it does that, it bounces the radio waves further away. So now these over-the-horizon radar systems can see for thousands of kilometers. And importantly, because of that, eventually could get around the curvature of the Earth. This is why the over-the-horizon radar systems are what the Canadian government wants for our Arctic, because the sort of traditional line of sight radars that use microwaves are more limited in how far they can see. They sort of send out a straight beam, and anything that crosses that beam will show up on a screen. But as soon as you're trying to see around the curvature of the Earth, the older systems can't do that. So this is newer technology that Canada wants, and specifically the North American Aerospace Defense Command wants, so that it can better fulfill its aerospace warning and aerospace control mission.
This is a multi-billion-dollar piece of the wider NORAD modernization plan. Andrea, could you maybe walk us through the potential timeline here, and when can Canadians expect the new radar network to turn on its initial capability, and how long might it take before the full system is completely operational?
Well, that's a good question. So according to the Government of Canada website that sort of tracks the anticipated timeline, it suggests that the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system, we will start the implementation of it in 2026 and 2027, that it should be operational by 2029, 2030, but then to get the full potential of the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system, it's likely to be beyond 2035. So we still need the North Warning System to be up and operating for many years to come yet, until we can get the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system up and running. And then, of course, the Government of Canada wants an additional system and other systems that they've put under the umbrella term Northwatch to be able to see even further into Canada's Arctic and beyond.
Andrea, maybe we could take a step back, and for our listeners just tuning in, just learning about over-the-horizon radar, NORAD, continental defense, maybe we could set some historical context. So Canada and the U.S. have been tracking northern approaches since the Cold War. We moved from the DEW line to the North Warning System. How did we get from these radar stations to the over-the-horizon systems we're building today? And maybe you could touch on what changed in technology as well as the environment to drive some of those evolutions.
Well, I think there are a couple of factors we have to consider. One are the threats that Canada and the United States were most concerned about, especially during the Cold War. So the Soviet Union started with gravity bear bombers, and then slowly but surely, as missile technology improved, they could send missiles through the Arctic to hold any North American target at risk. And now we have all sorts of potential missile systems. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have cruise missiles. We have now hypersonic missiles that can go very fast and very high. But we still have things like the low and slow problems. So the potential for remotely piloted autonomous systems or drones. And of course, in 2023, we had the Chinese balloon event. So it sort of came across the Pacific very slowly and loitered over key areas in both Canada and the United States. So the one thing that's changed, and therefore changed the systems that we use to provide domain awareness, has been the different threats and their trajectories and the technology behind that. But the other thing that's changed, of course, is the technology to be able to detect many of these threats. Over-the-horizon radars are not new. Certainly, the Australians have had a system in place since 1970. But it's how Canada and the United States thought best to deal with these threats. And the North Warning System, which you rightly point out was sort of operational in the late 80s, early 90s, was sufficient for the types of threats we were seeing, which was, typically the Soviet Union who would try and buzz us. But now we have different types of threats in terms of missiles. We have new adversaries. And it means that we can't afford just to see in the airspace and not even to the full extent of Canadian territory. We now need to be able to see what's happening in space, in the airspace, on land, on sea, undersea. And we also have to be able to see as far away in time and space, because with many of these missile systems, it's going to be really difficult to try and defeat them once they're launched. Ideally, we want to know and see that a launch may be happening and then use other tools like diplomatic tools, sanctions, call in ambassadors, strongly worded letters, anything to try and stop the launch to begin with. And that requires being able to see much further away from Canada and the United States.
The government has indicated that at least initial or temporary sites for the Arctic over-the-horizon radar might be in southern Ontario rather than up north. From a technical standpoint, could you explain why an Arctic radar system needs to physically be built in southern Ontario?
So the immediate need is to make sure that the North Warning System has a retirement plan. And so the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system it will replace eventually the North Warning System. And so the reason why we have a transmit site and a receive site in southern Ontario is because the radio waves are bounced off the ionosphere, and then they are able to travel thousands of kilometers sort of up to and a little bit past the North Warning System. We will need an additional system in the actual Arctic to be able to see then the full extent of Canada's territory and beyond. So really, physics dictates what's in the realm of possible, and the immediate priority is to make sure that there is backup for the North Warning System, because it is reaching the end of its serviceable life. It's been up and operating since the 1990s. Cold and metal are generally not friends. Now we've been able to extend the life. NASA took an Inuit indigenous owned company, has that contract, and also using artificial intelligence is actually allowing us to see that the North Warning System is picking up more activity than older algorithms were allowing analysts to see. So the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system will eventually take over from the North Warning System when it stops functioning just because of its age.
Andrea, thank you for that. I want to back up a moment and ask a question that I didn't have initially planned as an aside. But again, for maybe an audience that's just learning about these specific defense topics, earlier you mentioned some of the challenges or threats we face in these domains that require this new technology. But who are maybe some of the potential adversaries in mind when we're discussing some of these threats?
Well, we're certainly concerned still about Russia. Russia is described sort of as our proximate, persistent threat because of how close they are to us and because of their aggressive tendencies in the rest of the world, and the fact that they do have nuclear weapons. So certainly we're always concerned about Russia. We are concerned about China. Its military is growing in size and capabilities, and they certainly have some of these new missile systems that could hit targets in North America. Iran was a concern and may be a concern again in the future, but certainly the current war in Iran is sort of holding them to risk right now. And then there's always North Korea, which continues to practice failing, learning, and perfecting its intercontinental ballistic missile systems. So North Korea is certainly a concern. And then if we're talking about things like drones and balloons, well, that then opens the possibility to non-state actors and many other state actors because it's relatively low cost and low technology, but still can disrupt Canada and the United States.
Andrea, Canada isn't just designing the system from scratch, obviously. We signed a partnership, as you'll know, with Australia to adapt their Jindalee Operational Radar Network technology. Why did we look to the Australian desert to solve an Arctic surveillance problem? And how do you adapt a system built for, I guess, the Southern Hemisphere to work in Canada with its vast northern geography?
Well, the Australians are known as the over-the-horizon radar leaders. They've certainly had this Jindalee Operational Radar Network for many, many years. And so it's proven technology. It is, as you rightly point out, working in the Southern Hemisphere. So we're using the JORN in a northern latitude, but importantly, we're trying to avoid the auroral effects of the ionosphere by having the transmit and receiver site located in southern Ontario and bouncing off the ionosphere so that it isn't, we're not having to tackle that problem, which you rightly point out is going to be, it requires some scientific thinking. The reason why we have these beautiful northern lights in very high latitudes is because of the funky nature of the ionosphere. So making sure that any future system that's bouncing off the ionosphere at very high latitudes, we're still going to have to do a bit more research. And there's also the question of having an energy source for the receive and transmit site. And in Southern Ontario, there are all sorts of possibilities, but in an Arctic context, where often it's, diesel fuel that is the main energy source that they have there. Again, we're going to have to think about how we're going to have the energy supply that's consistent and importantly doesn't take away from an Arctic hamlet nearby.
Canada's radar investments, Andrea, are just one piece of a larger puzzle. How do projects like Over-the-Horizon Radar and Northwatch plug into the broader, I guess, multi-billion-dollar NORAD modernization plan? And how does the information collected by Canadian sensors actually get shared and used across the binational command with the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's a really big question. I'll start with why are we paying attention first to the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system? And that's because for both Canada and the United States, to be able to defend North America, they have to have domain awareness. They have to know what is coming at the approaches of North America, and that requires us to be able to see further out in time and space. So the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system is one piece. Future satellite systems are another piece, as well as future ground-based systems and maritime systems. But then you're right, we have to be able to collect all of this data, send it back to a control room so that analysts and AI and eventually quantum computing can help separate out what's noise versus what's a potential threat, and then be able to send the information to pilots, to naval vessels, to potentially other allies. And that's still what we're working out. There are parts of these systems that the public will never know about, and that's because we need to protect them. You want to harden them. You don't want to give information away to adversaries about how to disrupt those data feeds or how to spoof them. But this is where the United States has been calling for a cloud-based system and for this all-domain awareness so that we can actually link information and data coming from space, from the air, from land, from sea, from undersea, so that we have a complete all-domain picture of what's happening. And then you need a wider conversation about the command and control that we're going to need to be able to then deal with this information and come up with options as a result.
Just to build on that last part there, Andrea, we often, the average person rather, might hear the phrase all domain awareness in defense discussions. Outside of that ground-based radar, how do these systems tie into other layers of defense, like maybe satellites, underwater sensors, new fighter jet fleets like the F-35?
So we talk about this new age of systems. So the Arctic over-the-horizon radar is one system. Satellites will be another system. The F-35 is another system. Marine sensors, another system. So all of these sensors are collecting data and information that has to then be integrated and analyzed. And that means that having the capacity to analyze, store, and use all of that information is really a daunting task. And that requires that the Canadian Armed Forces has digital literacy. We're working on, or at least the Government of Canada is working on having maybe its own autonomous and national cloud to be able to store and protect all this information. So we're really talking about a potential revolution in military affairs as we see how critical data is to the defense of North America.
Building complex defense systems in Canada historically takes a long time, and it faces delays, changing priorities. Andrea, when you look at the timelines for continental defense upgrades like this, what would you say are maybe some of the primary structural hurdles or bureaucratic hurdles that might determine whether these projects get delivered on time or whether they get delayed?
Well, I think what's happening this time is that there's a very clear signal from the United States and from Canada. Remember, during the first Trump presidency, he and Prime Minister Trudeau actually sort of signed a letter that said, here are our priorities when it comes to the defense of North America. And the number one was we need better domain awareness. So that then sent a strong signal to government officials that things like the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system have to be priority number one. And the Government of Canada chose relatively quickly the Australian Jindalee system. And they started looking at potential transmit and receive sites. So it's actually going, I think, more quickly than many Canadians would realize. But we also have to appreciate that we're now dealing with levels of technology and sophistication that it's not just a one-off system. This is a system that is bouncing high-frequency radio waves off the ionosphere to detect what's happening, send a signal back. It has to be analyzed. You have to separate out the noise from the actual threats. You need to be able to share it. Many of these new systems we're trying to detect are coming at us that much more quickly. So it's an extra level of complication in there. So I do have sympathy for why some projects do take longer. I do think, however, in this case, the Arctic over-the-horizon radar system is going fairly quickly compared to some other projects.
Well, thanks, Andrea. We've had you on the podcast a lot, so thank you for always coming on and chatting with us. Often we look at NORAD modernization or Arctic security more broadly, but I don't think we've ever gotten together and discussed over-the-horizon radar more in depth. So it's been a great discussion. We've covered a lot. Before we wrap up today, do you think there's anything we missed that you want to give some airtime to, or anything you think is important for our audience to understand, which is tuning and listening right now?
Well, I think that, we're going to have to watch this space to see where additional transmit and receiver sites might be located. Because if we want the full Arctic over-the-horizon radar system, we're going to need 2 sets of receiver sites and 2 sets of transmission sites. So that's one thing to watch out for. But also to keep an eye on the other systems that are coming online. Certainly there's been very little information about what is now known as Northwatch, which is again going to be a system of systems. So a polar over-the-horizon radar system and a satellite-based system and some ground sensors. So watching that space is going to be really interesting as well. And then, of course, we have to remember that Indigenous rights holders will need to be at the table to understand what the implications are for having these systems and what opportunities there are for Indigenous businesses and communities to see some benefits from these quite bespoke military systems.
To close out this week's episode, we'll turn to Dr. Malcolm Davis. Malcolm is a strategic analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Defence Strategy Program. Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, my pleasure.
So, in June of 2026, Canada and Australia finalized a $2.5 billion Arctic over-the-horizon radar agreement. For a general audience, can you explain what's actually being bought under this deal and what specific equipment or software Australia is transferring to Canada?
Essentially, Canada is buying the Jindalee over-the-horizon radar. It's essentially an over-the-horizon backscatter radar that basically transmits radar signals up onto the ionosphere, bounces off the ionosphere to allow very long-range detection of ships and aircraft. Out to about 3,000 kilometers is the typical range for Jindalee over-the-horizon radar, or JORN, as we call it here in Australia. And essentially what Canada will be buying will be the transmitters, the radar dishes, so they're not really dishes, they're sort of large antenna arrays. So those antenna arrays, as well as all the operating systems and hardware to enable Canada to be able to utilize these particular this particular system. And the whole purpose of Canada acquiring JORN, or the over-horizon radar, is to fill gaps in its coverage for NORAD and to enhance Canada's ability to maintain watch over the Arctic in particular, where there's increasing concern about activities such as from Russia and China.
The Australian government spent many decades developing and upgrading its JORN system. Based on some of the challenges involved in that process, how realistic is it, do you think, that Canada's goal of having this new system running by December 2029 could be on track?
Well, like any defence acquisition project is always runs the risk of cost blowouts and project delays. And I think that's a law of the universe, which we must all accept. I think that there's a possibility, obviously, that we'll get it done by 2029, which is the goal. But we'll see what happens. I think Australia's got a lot of expertise in this system. It's been operating it for 40 years. So I think that there's a very good chance we'll get it done and up in terms of initial operating capability by late 2029. And that would be a great achievement. If there's a delay, there's a delay. We have to work around that. But hopefully there won't be any delays.
Dr. Davis, I'm not sure how much you can speak to Canada's current system in place, the North Warning System, but would you be able to speak at all to how the JORN system might be an upgrade to what Canada's currently using to monitor its Arctic?
Well, look, I think the key thing with JORN is that its range, its ability to detect targets both in the air and on the surface of the ocean, out to about 3,000 kilometers, which is a distant range. Canada's current system is based up, my understanding, is more on traditional radar stations. You used to have in the Cold War the Dew line stretching across northern Canada. Well, obviously they've upgraded that since then, but JORN will add that extra layer that adds that even greater range out across the Arctic. And I think the other key point to remember about over-the-horizon radar is it doesn't give you necessarily a precise information on the type of target beyond whether it's an aircraft or a ship. And I think that JORN is part of a system of systems. So, for example, for Australia, we have JORN, but we also have the E7 Wedgetail, airborne early warning and control aircraft, which gives us that precise coordination and control capability. So really, Canada acquiring JORN should also be looking at something similar in terms of airborne early warning and control, and they're probably already looking at that in terms of capabilities to essentially add that level of granularity and accuracy. JORN gives the broad information of what's out there, what's happening, and you need other systems to work with it to give you the precise location for, say, for example, for running an intercept with a fighter aircraft.
Now, Dr. Davis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe this is one of the biggest, at least, defense exports in Australian history. So beyond just this being a business transaction, how does sharing this kind of software and military capability impact, if at all, the defense relationship between Canada and Australia?
Well, I think that defense relationship between Canada and Australia is really important. Canada and Australia are both middle powers. We both have to increase our defense cooperation. Obviously, we're both allies of the United States, but right at the moment, the US is a little bit uncertain in terms of its current direction in its defense and foreign policy. And I think that's been made clear in numerous speeches, particularly by Prime Minister Carney in recent months. So I think that it makes eminent sense for Canada and Australia to collaborate on defense technology. JORN, I think, is a starting point for that, but there are other areas where Canada might play a role. For example, there's already been interest expressed in Ottawa about GhostBat, the MQ-28 GhostBat collaborative combat aircraft, whether Canada could look at possibly becoming involved in that. Canada has just joined the GCAP program as an observer. Australia may make a similar move in coming years. We still don't know about that, but it's a possibility. So there's collaborative possibilities there that I think we need to build upon, and JORN is the starting point for all this.
So as you kind of alluded to there, Prime Minister Carney is known for speeches he's made lately about Canada's need to diversify away from the United States amid the uncertainty we've seen in the American political system and shifts in its foreign policy. Maybe for our Canadian listeners who are very aware of the Canadian situation, maybe you could explain what the sentiment currently is in Australia and how much we might align there.
I think Australia hasn't gone as far as Canada in this regard. We still see the United States as the vital strategic ally, and we're working very hard in that regard through things like AUKUS to strengthen that relationship. We still have U.S. forces present in Australia, particularly U.S. Marine Corps forces in the Northern Territory. We have U.S. Air Force bomber deployments out to Australia on a fairly regular basis. And I see that cooperation expanding, not reducing in coming years and so forth. So I'm not sure that we're prepared to go to the same extent as Canada has in terms of outlining a distinct shift away from the United States towards a more independent middle power approach. Having said that, Australia is, I think, along the same lines, diversifying its defense relationships. We have a very important, almost alliance relationship with Japan. We're building up relations with Canada. I think we're building relations with South Korea, with the Philippines. So we're recognizing that we do need to be more self-reliant for starters, so we can do more ourselves. But we also need to work more closely with our partners and allies across the Indo-Pacific region. And obviously Canada is a Pacific partner in every sense of the word, but we are strengthening our diversification in terms of our defense and security with a range of partners. Not necessarily to sort of, on the assumption that somehow the Americans won't be there for us, but I think it just makes eminent sense to have a greater network of allies and partners across the region rather than relying purely on one major power to help defend our country.
Well, Dr. Davis, thanks so much for joining us today. We've been chatting for just a brief period of time here, but if you could offer any final insights maybe on this deal between Australia and Canada, the technology itself, JORN, or maybe even reflect on something you have already reflected on a bit, but the future of the Canadian-Australian defense relationship, the floor is yours if you have some final thoughts.
Great. Well, look, as I said, I think JORN is the beginning of the process, certainly not the end point. JORN is a starting point whereby Australia and Canada can work together on a major project that strengthens Canada's defence and security. Obviously, it has benefits down here in Australia in terms of job growth, with BAE Australia being the main provider for this capability. But I think it opens the door to future collaboration in other areas. I talked about the Ghost Bat. I think that's important. The potential for Australia to join GCAP as an observer is something that I think should be seriously considered here in Canberra. And I think there probably are other areas of defence collaboration that we could work together, particularly in terms of naval capabilities, that I think should be of interest to Canada. So I think that there's every reason to strengthen this relationship going forward and to expand it. And I think that this is going to be an exciting opportunity for both Canberra and Ottawa to essentially build a new defence cooperation approach and strengthen that relationship, whilst not necessarily moving decisively away from the United States, at least on Australia's part. And I think the US would understand this and see this as beneficial to themselves as well.
Well, Dr. Davis, thanks for providing your analysis today. And over here at the CDA Institute, we love and follow closely the work of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So we look forward to reading more of your work. And thanks for joining us today. Always great to have our Australian cousins on to talk defense. And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.